human shields? Well, let's ask the obvious second question, and I'll ask you to answer honestly and candidly. How many of you are aware that all the human rights organizations that investigated that question reached the conclusion that Hamas had not engaged in human shielding? How many of you know that? Okay, this is a smarter audience. You would say about 10%. In most places, it's pretty close to zero. But even an informed, interested audience, otherwise you wouldn't be here tonight. So you're informed, you're interested, and you are in many other respects not your typical cross-section of Americans. About 10% knew a basic fact about what happened in Gaza. That contrary to all of those allegations which every one of you had heard, in fact, at least so far as the human rights organizations were able to determine, there was no human shielding in Gaza. I should amend that. No human shielding by Hamas. Of course, there was extensive human shielding by Israel using Palestinian civilians. In the event, Amnesty goes on to say, even if it were true that Hamas had engaged in human shielding, it couldn't explain the deaths in Gaza. Why? Well, Amnesty said, in the attacks that caused the greatest number of fatalities and injuries, the victims were not caught in crossfire, and they were not shielding militants. Well, they were not caught in crossfire, and they were not shielding militants. How did those 1,400 people die in Gaza? Well, Amnesty says many were killed when their homes were bombed while they slept. Others were going about their daily activities in their homes, sitting in the yard, hanging the laundry on the roof, when they were targeted by airstrikes or tank shelling. How did children die in Gaza? How did those 350 children get dispatched to their maker prematurely? Gaza's Amnesty says the children were studying or playing in their bedrooms or on the roof or outside their homes when they were struck by missiles or tank shells. All the human rights organizations concurred, they agreed, that Israel committed multiple war crimes and possibly or definitely crimes against humanity in Gaza. They also said that Hamas committed comparable crimes, but on an incomparably smaller scale. After all, how many crimes can ants commit against someone incinerating them with a magnifying glass? On January 18th, Israel withdrew from parts of Gaza. Israel withdrew from parts of Gaza. Now, many of the human rights reports alleged that Israel had engaged in indiscriminate attacks on Gaza, which is a war crime. But it's also true to say that many of the attacks in Gaza by Israel were very discriminate. They weren't indiscriminate or arbitrary at all, because Israel was determined that when it left Gaza after those 22 days, that the life of the people there would be yet more miserable than the life they endured during the blockade. So there was one operative flour mill in Gaza, because the other flour mills required equipment which Israel wouldn't allow in. There was one operative flour mill, the Al-Badr flour mill. In the course of the 22 days, Israel very discriminately destroyed that flour mill to make sure the people of Gaza would be deprived of one of their most basic staples. There were 29 ready-mix cement factories in Gaza. Israel destroyed 22 of the 29 ready-mix cement factories to make sure the people of Gaza can't rebuild. And there was something to rebuild. Israel left behind 600,000 tons of rubble. 600,000 tons of rubble. after January 2009, the siege continued, but now exacerbated by the death and destruction inflicted during those 22 days and the inability of the people in Gaza to rebuild from that destruction. In May 2010, a flotilla, one in a long series of flotillas, a flotilla headed towards Gaza. And they said they were going to break the siege which was causing a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Israel said it's not true. There's no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The international humanitarian and human rights organizations which work directly in Gaza, they dissented. They said there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Oxfam, the humanitarian organization, it said, contrary to what the Israeli government states, the humanitarian aid allowed into Gaza is only a fraction of what is needed to answer the enormous needs of an exhausted people. The World Health Organization, it said, Israel is blocking vital medical supplies from entering the Gaza Strip. The International Committee of the Red Cross, it said the blockade of Gaza is having a devastating impact on the 1.5 million people living there. The Turkel report, which came out, as I mentioned, on Sunday, it says, it acknowledges all the human rights organizations, all the humanitarian relief organizations, it acknowledges that they said there was a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And then they go on to say Israel denied there was a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And then they proceed to examine this question very objectively and meticulously, as Israeli lawyers are known to do. And they reached the conclusion that Israel was right. And the humanitarian and human rights organizations, the ICRC, the Red Cross, the Oxfam, the World Health Organization, they were all wrong. And the reason they were all wrong was this. According to the Turkel Commission, there was no starvation in Gaza, or the people were not starving to death, they were surviving. And then, if they were not starving, well, this is literally true. And Turkel is a former head of the, a former member of the Israeli Supreme Court. He said, so long as they weren't starving to death, then Israel has met all of its humanitarian responsibilities. So long as Israeli policies are just shy of genocide, according to the Turkel Committee, there's no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. At the time, a strange kind of debate ensued. I'm referring now to the period right after the events of May 31st. The Israelis were saying, we put the people of Gaza on a starvation plus diet. It wasn't quite starvation, it was starvation plus. The human rights organizations replied, well, that's not true. You put them in effect in a starvation diet. And in the midst of this debate, this, again, if I could use the word surreal debate, the most fundamental point was lost. What right did Israel have to put the people of Gaza on any diet? What right does Israel have to put the people of Gaza on any diet? Now, even Israel's harshest critics, they agreed with Israel on one point. They said Israel did have the right to prevent weapons from reaching Gaza. Israel did have the right to prevent weapons from reaching Gaza. Well, that's not altogether obvious. The international law on that question is technically neutral, which is to say, it doesn't take a stand on whether or not peoples fighting for self-determination have the right to use armed force. So it's not altogether true that Israel had the right to prevent weapons from entering Gaza, because if the people of Gaza have the right to use armed force, and the law is neutral on that question, then as B follows A, they have the right to receive weapons. Now, some of you in the audience, and maybe the preponderance of the people in the audience, they don't want to go there. Let's not talk about weapons, let's not talk about fighting, let's not talk about killing. And frankly, I'm sympathetic to that reaction. It's all too easy for people here to talk about using weapons and death and everything that attends it over there. So even if we leave aside that issue, let's set it aside. The international community was still being completely hypocritical. Why? Or I should say, Israel's harshest critics were still being hypocritical. Why? Well, Amnesty International issued a report entitled Fueling Conflict, right after the Israeli assault on Gaza. And Amnesty said, under international law, as well as domestic American law, it's illegal to transfer weapons to a state or a non-state party, which is a consistent violator of human rights. So Amnesty said, yes, Hamas should not receive weapons, that's correct, because it's a consistent violator of human rights. But then Amnesty went on to say that Israel, too, should be subjected to a total and comprehensive embargo on arms, because it, too, is a consistent violator of human rights. To the extent that even Israel's harshest critics said that Hamas should be prevented from receiving weapons, but didn't go on to say that Israel, too, should be prevented from receiving weapons. They were being completely hypocritical. Not by my standard, not by some idiosyncratic or eccentric standard, but by the standard set by Amnesty International. The standard, it says, is based on international as well as domestic American law. Well, as all of you know, on May 31st, Israel attacked the Mavi Marmara. The Turkel Committee doesn't like that, Commission doesn't like that word. It said it didn't attack the Mavi Marmara, it attempted to capture the boat. So I'll be scrupulous and use their language. At the end of the attack, there were conflicting accounts about what happened, and we'll probably never know the exact sequence of events in those fateful hours. The attack began at 4:26 a.m. The most authoritative report that's come out so far was the one commissioned by, mandated by the Human Rights Council, or Commission, I forgot, Council or Commission, mandated by the Human Rights Commission. I'm not a big fan of the Human Rights Commission, I have to say, but nonetheless, it has to also be said that when they do appoint investigatory commissions, they generally pick people of very high stature, respected international jurists, whether it was the case of Richard Goldstone, or also in the case of the the jurists who were sent to investigate what happened in Mavi Marmara. I don't have time to go into all of their findings,